Well, good evening, everyone. Not so many people. Oh, no pressure here. All right, this means I got to be articulate. It's always hard with a microphone, too. I'm not usually plugged in. I can boom my voice better than that. But, all right, if you can bear with me with the device, then we'll move on. It's a difficult subject for me to just start in without some kind of preamble, because we're talking about peoples, lots of peoples over a long time. And, we always ask questions like, when were the first people here? What do archaeologists think about that? And the native people will tell you, oh, we've always been here. Archaeologists, we have our own ideas, but the native people believe they've always been here. They didn't come from anywhere else. That Creator put each tribe within their specific place so that they would tend to those places and steward them. I'm raised as an archaeologist, so I'm not quite as creative in that point of view. And so for me, I look at beginnings when we have archaeological data that speaks of first things. And we know that people have been in the Americas since the Great Ice Age. That's a long time ago. When? Well, we don't know, because the clock keeps getting pushed back further and further as new finds teach us more. And I suspect we'll come full circle and say, oh, they've always been here. So in any case, we have two kind of worldviews. One is what I've learned from the native people teaching me and telling me, and the other things comes from my, the other side of my view comes from my academic background. And so somehow I have to weave both of those worldviews into my life and pursue that. So we're going to start with an overview. This is just a brief overview, maybe not so brief for you guys in the audience, but brief for me, because we're going to start in the beginning, just like a James Michener novel. He always starts in the beginning and builds off from that. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you for being my button pusher. All right. So for us today in our busy world, it's hard to imagine the way things were. And what was life like? What was the California landscape like before all the houses and traffic came in and all the things that kind of drive us crazy now? It's hard to imagine because that view has become more difficult to see. And yet, there's still a lot of old-time California out there if you know how to see it and how to interpret it. So next slide. For native people, they talk about beginnings, as all people do. If you ever read Genesis in the Bible, it's not so easy to understand at its face value. You've got people marrying people when there's no one else there. There's a lot of stories, because those were oral traditions. And oral traditions are flexible. They're there to teach a story, an idea. And the story as it unwinds becomes just a vehicle to get to a moral or to an idea. And when we start writing these stories down, they become fixed. They're no longer fluid anymore. And they become more difficult to understand because we lose the ideas of the storytellers and the intent of what they meant to say. So here in California, in your home right here in this area, we do have stories of the beginning of Genesis that the native people had. And we don't have too many of these stories because there's been so much history in between that hasn't always been that favorable for native people. And so a lot of the voices are quiet and we don't know a lot of things. But we do have a story of beginnings here. So I'll start with that. And then we're going to go through 14,000 years of culture and history in about an hour, so buckle up. We're going to roll. So picture an evening by a campfire, maybe on the ridge up here, everybody gathering around, and the elders, talking about stories. And with the stories comes an obligation to understand what they mean, because there's a moral to the stories. And we have a story from Mission Santa Cruz about beginnings here. And it starts like this. Once upon a time, there was an endless sea, a cosmic sea of eternity. And on that eternal sea, there was a small spot of land. And on the land were three spirit beings. There was coyote, eagle, and hummingbird. When native people talk about coyote, they're not so much talking about the four-legged coyote as much as the intent, the spiritual essence, the character of the individual coyote. And for native people, coyote is often a trickster, kind of a wise guy, a braggart, full of himself. And from him come stories about, be careful Coyote, don't be like Coyote, and so forth. You remember the Roadrunner Coyote cartoons? You know, he gets that Acme missile from somewhere, and he's got it zoned in on the Roadrunner. He's running along, meep, meep, and then, you know, Coyote pulls the trigger on the missile, and you know what's going to happen, right? Kablooey! He blows up in his face because he's smart. He's a trickster, but everything backfires because he's that way. And so for Native people, Coyote is like that in a way too. So they speak about old man Coyote from the mythical past. Whereas Hummingbird is a gentle spirit, love, trust, innocence, goodness. And so you've got these two characters in this eternal sea, right, facing off with each other. Eagle, Seir in the local language, was a messenger beyond to the Great Spirit, the Big Holy, you know, God we would say, right? And the Big Holy lived somewhere by the sun, which they refer to locally as men. And so Eagle is a conveyor to another realm. Well, in this cosmic sea with Coyote, you know, and his wise ideas, and Hummingbird kind of telling him to be cool, you know, be nice, don't be a jerk. And this went on for eternity until one day the waters begin to recede. And as the waters go down, they realize they're not on an island anymore, they're on a mountaintop. And so, as they look from their perch on the mountaintop, they see world makers making trees and rivers and birds, and things are popping up all over the place. And so Hummingbird says to Coyote, wow, you know, why don't you go down and take a look and tell us what you see? Next slide. And so Coyote says, all right, and he goes down the hill, and he starts taking inventory of what he sees. Flowers, fish, birds, insects, the whole thing. And so he goes hiking back up to the top of the mountain and reports on what he has seen and does inventory. And among the various creatures, he's vexed by one. One walked on 2 legs. And Hummingbird says, well, that is a woman, that's to be your wife. And so Coyote marries this first woman, and their children become the tribes as they distribute over the landscape. All right, so these are stories that are hard for us to relate to sometimes. But like I said, with Genesis again, it's also kind of difficult to figure out where the wife to, what is it, one of the sons, you know, comes from. There's not supposed to be any other people. But it isn't the point about the details, it's the moral about being good and doing right. So we have Coyote stories told by the campfires and stories of animals and their behaviors. Next slide. And stories like how Hummingbird stole fire. Well, there was a time when first people were made and they were poor. They didn't know how to take care of themselves and were pretty wretched. And so Hummingbird kind of took pity on these new people and their inability to cope with nature at the time. And so he held a council. In Native stories, I love this, because in councils you can have a tree there, you can have a mountaintop, you know, they're all there around the council, however that works, right? And so Hummingbird says we should give the people fire so they can be warm and cook their food. And, you know, everybody goes, okay, it's your idea, go get it. Well, badger people have fire, badgers. They live in the ground. And as many of you know, you don't want to stick your hand in a badger hole because they're pretty ornery, right? And that's part of their character too. So Hummingbird comes to Badger's lodge and sees the smoke coming out of the lodge. And he comes in, and with many Native Californians, tradition is you feed guests when they come. You feed them first. And so Hummingbird comes in, and Badger, you know, follows through on the right etiquette and produces food and prepares food for this new guest, Hummingbird. So after a while, they do the politenesses and proper etiquette. Hummingbird says, well, I'd like one of those embers to give to people so they can have fire. And Badger says, no. Okay, so Hummingbird splits. Well, you know how stories are. They have to go back and forth and back and forth. I'll shorten this. So Hummingbird comes back on his 4th time. And he comes back, and Badger goes, here comes Hummingbird again. And so he throws a deer skin over the fire to hide it. You know, they don't want him to have fire. So Hummingbird comes in, they go through the politenesses again, and Hummingbird notices that the deer hide has an arrow hole in it, and he can see the embers below. And so he goes, hey, look over there. So Badger turns around, Hummingbird dives in, and with his long beak, he takes on these embers, stuffs it under his chin, and splits. So basically, Hummingbird steals fire, and he brings it back to the people, and that's why he has a red neck, red chin. Okay, that's cool. But I don't know the story about the green hummingbirds, right? I'm sure there were stories too. Next slide. So we have stories of people, and people spread out over the lands, and there are many maps that anthropologists and linguists have put together of the various types of tribal communities in California, and they're kind of wrong. What you're looking at here with all these tribes, I'm sorry it's blurry, my computer's blurry. So what you're looking at are names, but these are not names of polities, they're names of language families. California once had one of the greatest populations of hunting-gathering people in all of North America. So think about that. You've heard of the Sioux, the Iroquois, the Calusa, the Cherokee, all of those guys, well, they're fighting well. But California had the greatest population density of all. We're also one of the world's greatest mosaics of languages. There were many languages spoken here because there were many people coming here over a long time, merging with earlier groups, sometimes displacing them, sometimes marrying into. So California is a very complex culture area. And so most of you are familiar with the region of San Francisco Bay and Monterey Bay, as referred to as Ohlone. Well, the word Ohlone has become a term of convenience for us, but it's not one from the past. It was popularized actually in the 1960s because earlier anthropologists from UC Berkeley, when the field of anthropology was founded around the turn of the last century, saw there were shared languages. There was a big focus on recording language in the day because they knew that many of the tribal languages were disappearing pretty fast. In fact, the people were recovering from a great holocaust of colonization, which I'll touch on at the end briefly. But the anthropologists, and I'm like fourth generation from this, never thought about saving the people. It was about saving the data, right? But consequently, they did record a great deal. And so when they looked at the languages that were still resonant amongst Mission Indian populations that were still around, they came up with the term Costanoan, which means coastal people, from the Spanish word costaños. Well, with the advent of the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s, Native people decided we don't want to be called by what anthropologists call us. And so the Galvan family, actually, from Mission San Jose, began to publish in the early California Historical, or the Indian Historian, a new magazine that had just come out. And he coined the word Ohlone to speak to the larger cultural region. And so now we're familiar with the word Ohlone, and we treat them like they're a single nation. And that's not true. Within the term Ohlone, there were 50 tribes. There are 7 distinct languages. It was a cosmopolitan landscape, much like now where you have Santa Cruz, Aptos, San Jose, Mountain View. I could substitute tribal names for those places. So the political scene is much more complex. And I'll touch on that too when I show you a map of all of that. But I just wanted to get that straight right now. The word Ohlone is like the word European, or the word African, or Asian. You know there are many cultures there, with different languages and different traditions. And so too, that was the case here in the day. So we have a very complex region. Next slide. So the Spanish start recording, and that's when history changes from prehistory. Native people don't like the word prehistory generally, because it implies no history. And that's not the case, obviously. As an archaeologist, I put a lot of history in prehistory. But for us, the recorded record begins when journalists first come through. As early as 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sails up just 20 years after Cortez conquers Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, and the Aztecs. And they move westward, and they coincidentally discover the Pacific. How can you discover that? But okay, they did for Europe. And so they begin building ships and creating a maritime trade. They make it to the Orient. These ships start making passage across the Pacific, and they're looking for ports and harbors where they can refill their water casks and get fresh food. And so there's an interest in the California coast because these ships oftentimes make landfall in California, stay offshore, and then head south to San Blas and Acapulco, where they unload their cargo from China. So there was this maritime conveyor belt that was developing, and California became party to that. And so Cabrillo's task was to sail up the coast and look for safe harbors. They were also looking for a passage to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific, which we know didn't exist, or doesn't exist, but they didn't without Google Earth. And so what they did was they sent expeditions for it. So Cabrillo sets forth, he gets up to the Channel Islands, where he's amazed by the Chumash people of Santa Barbara, who have ocean-going canoes. They stitched plank canoes together, made out of redwood, and so that the Channel Islands were occupied by thousands of people. So Cabrillo gets out with his banners, I'm going to claim this for the His Imperial Highness of Spain, as they were wont to do, and they were watching this whole show, and he slips on the algae-covered rocks and breaks his arm. Well, that'll do him in. Actually, he gets gangrenous later on the voyage, he dies. But these become first contacts from our perspective. And so Cabrillo, his expedition goes forth. They see a harbor out here, and they call it the Bay of the Pine Trees. They hear some sea lions barking, and they name this place Point of Land, Point Lobos, Point of the Wolves, the Sea Wolves, and they continue northward. So that's history. And nothing much happens. So a little later, you've got Sir Francis Drake, who is either a pirate or a letter of marque, depending on whose side you're on. And he is waiting in Marin somewhere to gather the Black Ship, the Manila Galleon, which he takes in 1579, which creates quite a stir with Spain, because this is the first other European to enter the Pacific. And after a while, the floodgates open, and then the French, the Dutch, everyone's in the game now, the colonial game. 1602, another sea captain, Sebastian Vizcaíno, comes up, also looking for a harbor. He is the first one to drop anchor in this harbor below us, the Bay of the Pines, and he renames it Monterey after the Viceroy of Mexico. Very PC thing to do for a military commander, the king's right-hand man. I named a bay after you. So they made some points there. And he describes the bay as being a fabulous harbor, big enough to hold the imperial fleet of Spain. Well, it's not that good, for sailing ships. But, he's trying to make a name for himself. So word got out of this harbor, and he met the native people, who he refers to as the heathens, which kind of sets the tone of the music right there. And he says, they're very nice people, they feed us, because again, that's custom. So he's being fed, and he sails from Monterey, newly named, at the end of December, sails by Año Nuevo, New Year's Point, named because of him and his expedition. Okay, so all of that's fine and well. The word gets back to Imperial Spain about this so-called fabulous harbor, and nothing happens. Not for a long, long time, because now other Europeans are competing, and the Russians are now also in Alaska. That used to be Russian territory, and they're harvesting the various fur seals and fur-bearing animals. They are interested in setting up a colony further south, somewhere warmer where they can grow vegetables to support their hunters further north. And of course, Fort Ross becomes that legacy further north, and Bodega Bay becomes their harbor. At any rate, and the Spaniards say, well, wait a minute, that's our territory. And so by 1740, the Russians are coming down, and Spain by this time says, okay, it's time to colonize this area and grab our territory. And so with that, they mount an expedition from Baja California and Presidio Loreto, and under the command of a gentleman named Don Gaspar de Portola. He bought his commission because he was wealthy. He leads an expedition northward with 200 horses and mules, an engineer named Miguel Costanzo, who writes, and a Franciscan priest named Juan Crespi, who was a great diarist. And so these are our accounts, first contacts through these accounts. And that is the basis of some of the information I present. And you have to filter what they say, because of course they're looking through European eyes of the time, right? So you have to understand where they're coming from to understand what they're trying to say. So 1769, the expedition sets out. They encounter the Chumash of Santa Barbara too. Big villages of 4,000 people in a village. Every time they come to a village, they've got to eat, they get fed, there's all this ritual and custom, and then they proceed, say thank you, they move on, they don't get very far, and they hit another village with another leader, repeat the custom, they do it. And finally, Juan Crespi writes in his diary, we're camping away from the Indians now, so that we can sleep at night. So you see, these are first contacts. They're very, very positive, open, and you've got to respect the native ability to embrace people, because they have no need to, but they do. And so they welcome these people, provide guides when they need them, and the expedition continues forward. Long story, they get to Monterey, which they're under orders to find, and they don't recognize it. And so they continue northward, and right below us, a little farther below, they enter a little valley that they hobble their horses in. They call it the Little Corral. Corlitos, right? And so they're there, and Crespi sees the first redwood trees they've ever seen. They don't know what they are. And they call them sabines. They say they've got little tiny pine cones for a big, huge tree. And he says they stand tall like so many candles, a real blessing of timber. And how, right? So then they continue along by Larkin Valley Road and past the Casco Adobe State Parks, right? Winter State Parks. And so then they continue north past a community called Choquel. And they go past another native group called the Apto. And then they come into downtown Santa Cruz since the fall of 1769, and there are no more native people, and now they need them because they've run out of food. They're supposed to meet a supply ship. Well, they never see it. That gets blown way south. And so they're dependent on the native people for food. When they get to Santa Cruz in the fall of 1769, they're noticing that all the land is burned. All the grasslands are burned. And where are those native people now to feed us, they're wondering. They see trails going to the hills. Well, they don't know what we know. What we know is the people around the uplands, because it's acorn harvest time, right? They've left the coastal village, they're in the upland now. But the expedition is going straight ahead. So they can't feed their horses and mules, and they continue north until they get to Rancho del Oso State Park, big basin by the sea. And by this time, some of the soldiers are dying, probably from scurvy, and which was something they couldn't deal with at that time yet. And so Father Crespi gives last rites, supreme unction to these soldiers. It's serious business. Right? It's a major expedition. And as if it isn't bad enough for them, it rains. You know? So picture all your leather, armor, metal gear. They don't have any Gore-Tex. So now they're wet. And rather than making things worse, in the morning these soldiers are well. They're doing well. And I read in Crespi's diaries, we're eating the manzanitas, the little apples, they call them. And they're eating the native foods, so they're probably getting a vitamin C supplement. Anyway, in the morning, these guys are well. Crespi goes, it's a miracle. We should build a mission here. Maybe not. Rancho del Oso is not that big. But they call it La Salud, good health. And at low tide, they hike along where, Devil's Slide is. There's no higher one. So they get up north to Año Nuevo by the Parks Visitor Center. And they're greeted by a man from the Koroste people. And he escorts them to a large village over some hills behind Cosanoa Lodge, which is now a cultural preserve we created, 220-acre preserve for the native people, so that they have a place to practice their land stewardship. That's happening right now. But I forgot to tell you, the native people are still here, all right? There's this perception that they're, from the Natural History Cabinet, the geologic specimens, right? And that's not the case. There's a continuity. The people are still here. They're the descendants I work with, I consult with regularly, and we're trying to bring the people back to their land in our parks. So these are good things. It's a new thing that we're working with. So I just want to throw that out. Also, Native people generally do a welcoming. I'm not Native, so I tend to forget. You tend to acknowledge whose land you're on. And so I would say this is the land of the Ohlone, but that's not specific enough. So what I would say is this is the land of the Chalotaka, the Wipene, the Apto, and the Sayan people. What? Well, those are the tribes around, and they came up on these ridges to use these resources. So this was, a community property for the people. And so Sayan, that's where the word Sayani comes from, Sayani Road, right, in Scotts Valley there. So in any case, this was the scene, very complex, so we're on their property, I need to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that. And so back to my story. So the Spaniards are encountering these people, they continue up the coast in the Portola expedition, and they stumble into San Francisco Bay. Okay, there's a world-class harbor. From their perch on Sweeney Ridge, they can see the Farallon Islands, they can see Point Reyes, which they call San Francisco in the day, and now they know they've passed Monterey. And instead of looking down on the bay and going, well, there's a world-class harbor, no, instead they say, we've come to the end of our expedition, right? So you can imagine. But they also say there are many smokes around the bay. because there's a lot of people. And they hiked down through Crystal Springs Reservoir, which wasn't back then. There were 7 villages there of the South Shore people. They continued down the Little San Francisco Creek, which is still called San Francisco Creek. And they camp at the Stanford Shopping Center, where they hang out and they see the Palo Alto, the big redwoods, standing out like the Eiffel Tower on the plain. And they send Sergeant Ortega and his mountaineers to reconnoiter El Contra Costa, the other side. And so they go through San Jose, through the plains of Fremont, and they get up to Oakland, and they can see where the Golden Gate Bridge is going to be someday. And you just imagine in their mind going, good thing we didn't go that way. But now they're encountering all these new bays, and they can't get around it. So they circle back to Palo Alto. The expedition pulls up stakes, hikes all the way back to San Diego, where they finally rendezvous with their supply ship, and they try again. And with that, they get to Monterey and establish the first colonial foothold in Upper California, and establish the Royal Presidio of Monterey, which is a ditch with a bunch of sharp sticks pointing out, and the second of 21 missions in California, San Carlos. We call it Carmel Mission, which was a Thule reed hut with a fallen oak limb for an altar. So that's the beginnings. That's how it starts. But as an archaeologist, it's sort of amusing to me because we see deep time. But the Spaniards couldn't. They didn't have any sense of deep time because their world was biblical. And biblical time was different than what we reckon now, right? With radiocarbon dating and so forth. And so the Spaniards had no way to see deep time. Next slide. We do, as archaeologists. In the Ice Age, when people first get here, we know not when, but we do know that it was a lot colder. And during the Great Ice Age, so much fresh water was locked up in ice that the world's sea level was 300 feet lower than it is now. That means Java, Borneo, Indonesia was connected to Thailand. England and France were connected, they were one, and Siberia and Alaska were connected. Not for a brief time, but for many thousands of years. Those were the land bridges that people used to migrate and move around. And yet, those ancestors were not foolish. They were us. They're intellectually us. And so you see people getting in boats with no horizon going to Australia 50,000 years ago or more. So they're mariners in those days too. So in any case, this was what was on the menu for first people when they come here. Columbian mammoths, not woolly mammoths. I found a Columbian mammoth in Castroville in the artichokes. And first thing I started saying is, look, we got an elephant. And of course the paleontologists, they're different. The paleontologists go, it's not an elephant, it's a proboscidean. Okay. And then I say, oh, it's a woolly mammoth. They go, no, it's not a woolly mammoth, it's a Columbian. Okay. So we're good. We got that straight. So Columbian mammoths stood about 14 foot high at the shoulder. That's a big meat package right there. We had camels and horses. Those are North American inventions. They migrate to the east. The way and become extinct here and become reintroduced later. The moose comes in from Asia into America. Things are moving, so are people. So that's the landscape. San Francisco Bay at that time would look like this, because San Francisco Bay was an oak woodland valley floor. It floods later when the Earth's climate warms and the Pleistocene ends and the glacial ice melts, and we see cataclysmic environmental change. Next slide. So at this time, the coast was about 3 miles out from where it is now. So here you see Castroville, and you've got the Monterey Bay Trench, the Marine Canyon. That canyon is like the Grand Canyon, which means that ever since day one, people had to go around it. So I'm still looking for the old stuff around Castroville. I think that's where it would be. In any case, that yellow, you're seeing the bright goldenrod yellow, was the coastline when first people came. So what are we missing, right? We're missing a lot. So the archaeology of the stones and bones and shell only gives you a limited window in interpreting the past. So we have to be careful about what we propose. We don't have the whole picture. Next slide. So around 10,000 years ago, the Earth's climate warms, and we entered 3 phases called the early, middle, and late Holocene. We're in the late Holocene now, and it's getting warmer. We're getting to be like it was in the middle Holocene. 6,000 to 3,000 years ago, the Earth's climate was warmer, and we're going into it again. So it'd be kind of cool to know what that was like, right? But when sea level rises, it takes out entire landscapes. The bay forms, the coastal edge as we know it forms. It only stabilizes around 4000 BC. My students always go, well, that's a long time ago. Not really. We have early writing back then in the old world. The first empire, Sumer, is founded. The epic tale of Gilgamesh is written, and it's about floods. You know, a lot of stories about floods, right? So we have the world's first empires then. We know who the world's first dictator was. His name was Sargon, right? So we put it in a perspective, the history and prehistory, you know, and it suddenly doesn't seem so distant. So once the landscape stabilized, repetitive use by native people on the landscape create visible archaeological sites. You can't see it until the land stabilizes. Next slide. And so the San Francisco Bay forms, and I'm bringing that up in this lecture because you can't talk about Santa Cruz without that big glow over the hill, San Francisco Bay. And it was true then just as it is now, because that's where the big populations were. Next slide. And as the bay formed its habitat, it takes time, and then we start seeing the growth of very large mounds. All around the bay, there used to be mounded sites, and for a long time, archaeologists supposed they were villages. And I was just talking to my friend Dr. Bob Cartier, who's in the audience, who came up with this idea that these mounds may have been actually places for boats to launch. And the light bulb went off in my head, and I now think the shell mounds are actually ports for trade and exchange around the bay. The Spaniards talk a lot about Tule balsa boats and their use on the bay. Next slide. The bay was a rich habitat, lots of resources. It was also a major commute route for trade and exchange and ideas. Next slide. And so these mounded sites began to form. This is a shell mound cut away, and all of that white stuff is dietary shell. There's bone in there, there's stone chipping debris, and the darkness is the charcoal from all the campfires. Now we take some of those soils and we work with paleobotanists because we can extract all the plant residues that are preserved in these soils and reconstruct entire landscapes that way. So that's a big thing we're doing in parks. A lot of my research is focused on reconstructing habitat right now. A lot of archaeology is less about artifacts and more about context. We're moving from trowels to microscopes more and more. So that, by the way, is near Davenport. It's a shell mound on the coast that is now a state park. Next slide. So along the Bay Shore, when the field of anthropology was formed around at UC Berkeley, turn of the last century, there was a Danish student named Niels Nelson who took it upon himself to map these mounded sites. He mapped 425 of these monumental mounds. Some were as big as football fields, 60 feet high. These are large structures. They're not dietary refuse. Many of them are more dirt than shell, so they're monuments. Every pyramid-building society on this planet, Egyptians or Mayans or the ziggurats of the Middle East, they always started from an earlier developmental phase that starts with mounds. And so that too was a trajectory going on here. You create sacred space with mounds. The world was viewed in layers, not as a globe. And so mounds create special space. Okay, it's a long story, I gotta move on. But there were 425 of these mounds mapped. There are like 6 left today. So a lot of people tell me, oh, I see the native people here were kind of simple, you know, because they don't see standing stones. They don't see a pyramid. But there once were these monumental features on the landscape. We've destroyed them, and so we don't see them anymore. Or the social complexity that goes with organizing the labor to build them. Next slide. That's the Emeryville mound as it's being destroyed. That's where the Bay Bridge comes out now, and there's nothing but traffic. And so you can see the fate of these mounds, they went. In those days, archaeologists did rush to salvage what they could, but they didn't have any radiocarbon dating. They didn't even use screens to recover the small things. So the data we get, again, is biased. And so our conclusions have to be taken with some consideration. Next slide. So this is the political landscape, kind of blurry, huh? Up until the 80s, we didn't know these names until a friend of mine, Dr. Randall Milliken, did his master's thesis and doctoral dissertation looking at mission records to reconstruct tribal boundaries. This is the political landscape of the Ohlone. These are tribes. Each polity controls about 10 by 10 square miles. That's not very much, but that's the area you garden, and you manage, and you hunt, and you're rooted to those places. And so tribal territories are not large. And they're interconnected through marriage and alliance networks that way. The people also had a market economy with coin, so they could trade things back and forth. I'll speak to that in a minute. But this is the political landscape. Next slide. I like this picture better. This one Randy did too. He just passed away last year with a brain tumor, and we lost the national treasure, I'm going to tell you. But luckily, he published his information and has archived it in a way that other researchers can access it. But what I want to share with you are these names. So we're in that area north of the Hylkema, and you can see the Chalomata up there above the Aptos. So we're kind of in that area, above Forest Nicene marks. But what I like about this map is Randy decided not to draw the boundaries edge to edge, because that's the way we think. For Native people, the boundaries are determined by the lands they managed, which they did. They did not live hand to mouth. They're manipulating the productivity of nature by fire, by pruning, coppicing, tilling. They're doing all of these techniques that make the land produce, which is why they didn't go to agriculture. It was a choice they decided not to make, because they could manipulate the land to produce for them. So this was a very managed landscape. It's gotten out of control. We have catastrophic fires now because we suppressed fire management by Native people. When they burned in the old days, they burned every year, and it kept the fuel wood down. The fires don't burn so hot. They burn clear through, and they're healthy. And much of Native California's botany is fire dependent. Ever wonder why? For 10, 14,000 years, people lighting it up. So in any case, I like this because the boundaries are not edge to edge. You need special places in between where wildlife can breathe, where you can hunt and gather things too. Because you're living in your landscape, all the time. I also want to advocate that they see the spiritual world in the land too, which means they're living in their church all the time too. Next slide. So native houses were made out of tule thatch. They put them over a framework of willow pole, build them in the fall for the upcoming winter. At the end of winter, they burn them down because they maintain the hygiene that way. You keep rebuilding anew every year. So they're reusable houses. I always look at these demonstration houses kind of jaundiced because they're kind of small. And what I know is a typical household would be mom, dad, kids, grandma, maybe crazy Aunt Mildred. They're all there, right, in this house. That's too small. Next slide. So that's more like it. This is a house from Clear Lake area, the Pomo people. Notice that it's a photograph, not an artist's sketch. It's because all of this is going on until quite recently. Any of you read about Ishi? He was the last Yahi. Why was he the last? Because Vigilante slaughtered his people 5 times, till there was only a handful left. And they hid for 40 years below Mount Lassen, not leaving any footprints, all by themselves, till eventually there's only Ishi. And he comes out of the mountains and gives up in 1911. That's 19 years before my father was born. So you put these things in a context, right? Because it's not ancient history, it's just yesterday. Next slide. So tules were important wherever you have marshes and estuaries and wetlands, tules will grow. And they use them for floating duck decoys, for boats, for baskets, for mats, for inside the house, clean mats. You can harvest the pollen for food, like just giant flower stalks. So it's an amazing plant, very important to native culture. Next slide. Fishing, of course, was also a big part of the diet. Offshore here, people learned to use hook and line fishing tackle. They made groove stone. They put a groove around a stone, lined it with some asphaltum sometimes, and used dog bane, Apocynon cannabinum, for a cordage. You don't see that much anymore. It's been eradicated because it loves to be plowed. It spreads, and so the farmers get rid of it. But it's a major cord plant. When we talk about native Californian people, you have to understand they're fiber-based. They're making strings, cordage, nets, baskets, featherwork, skins, and such. These are non-preservable things. They don't preserve. So if it wasn't for the native people's memory and ability to share that with us, we wouldn't know. To make a small net for fishing takes about 1,600 stalks of dog bane. And you have to coppice it at the ground, right at the ground, after the first frost. Not sooner, later, first frost. And then the cordage has the string making material is at its best, it's optimum. It's all things you have to know. And then they split the stems, pull out the fiber, weave it into cordage, make multiply rope, so forth. 1,600 stalks for a small net. Well, they're not roaming the land like, oh, there's one, you know. No, they're cultivating these things. They're creating patches for them. Other plants like soaproot, another important bulb. I still find patches in the mountains here where they're, you know, really thick. And I'm pretty sure those are old gardens. Where, and I'll speak to that again. So those gardens are still here when you can see them. You have to open your eyes up, and then you can see that legacy. So hook and line fishing, kelp was very important to the diet. How do we know? Because the kelp doesn't preserve. Because little tiny cephalopods, little tiny seashells, some specific to specific kelp species, are showing up at the archaeological sites. And so by proxy, we know that the kelp was there. I've spent a lot of time with people in Northern California who still go in the surf to gather kelp and process it for food. It's pretty good. So again, a big food item is in the sea. We have the sea mammals, the shellfish, the fish, the seabirds. It's a major food basket. Next slide. And of course, all the shells were food. And we see sandy bottom species and rocky shore species. They all tell us about where people are harvesting from. The most common shell I see in all the archaeological sites, even up here in the ridges, is mussel, the California ocean mussel. And the guy on the left, you guys recognize that. What is it? Abalone. You just spoke a native word. It comes from the Ronson dialect of Monterey. In Spanish called them abalorios. In any case, we don't find so many abalone shells in our coastal midden, which is a perplexion, but not really if you think about it, because they're exporting them to the interior, where the people cut them into ornaments and badges of membership for societies. And the people also harvested those little shells in the bottom. They're called olive snails, or Olivella biplicata for you technical folks. And the Olivella shell was the root for making shell bead money. It has no dietary value at all. The native people would harvest them on the beach, and not every beach has them. Only certain ones do. Like the Cruz de Año Nuevo, we're the most powerful of all the peninsula tribes. They're controlling the Olivella export from near Año Nuevo. That's also where there's a raw stone called Monterey chert that they used for making stone tools. So the Cruz, they were sitting not only on the bank, but they also have the raw stone material. So export, import creates rich people, and there are poor people. They had credit, they had debt, all of those things. We didn't invent any of that. So the olive snail that you see in the bottom of the picture is nicely colored browns and blacks. But money has to be uniform. And so the coastal people would bleach them by baking them in hearths till they turn white. And use a little basket sieve to stir them around so they don't turn, don't get all blackened. So they make them uniform in color. And then they export them to the interior where people fracture them into components. And then with stone-tipped twist drills, they drill a hole through it, grind it into shape. It's a lot of labor. When I teach my college classes, I hold up a $10 bill and go, what's that? The students go, it's $10. And I go, no, it's a rectangular piece of paper. We just gave it a value. So at least this is tangible. It takes time to make them, right? Okay, next slide. So shells were important in native diet. Fish, of course, I've already mentioned. There was a time we had a lot of anadromous fish migrating up our streams. We're doing studies on coho. We're at the southern kind of limit of where coho were, so they're not really dominant in the archaeological sites, but they are present. And the steelhead, of course, run up the stream still. So fishing was very important. Many fishermen out here probably know this is a trout, not a steelhead, but it's a picture, I needed it. And so next slide. And then on the water, people learned to harvest things like sea otters with tule boats. This is actually the limit of my computer technology. What I've done is I've superimposed a watercolor from 1816 on my own picture of otters. So I'm getting creative. But it conveys my point, and what you're looking at is a major food source for the native people. We get a lot of otter bones in the local archaeological sites. What's interesting is a lot of bones are skeletally complete, so it doesn't look like they're harvesting them for the meat as much as they are for the fur. Okay, no surprise, right? Next slide. Hook and line fishing can get complicated. These are hook and line sets with dog bait cordage. Notice the different color of dog bait string. It changes from region to region, so the people have an eye for that kind of stuff. You know, oh, you got your string from over there. You know, they can tell. So these are different kinds of fish hooks. They make them out of mussel shell and abalone and bone. They collected tar that washed up on the beach, natural asphaltum. Also some of the creeks up by Portola have tar seeps, and the people used it as an adhesive to waterproof things, the strings and such. So hook and line fishing is important. Next slide. Also harpoons on the left, you're looking at elk antler harpoons. Those are carved with stone tools and ground into a shape. They're about a foot and a half long. And they're used mostly in estuaries, where you get an estuary, like the mouth of San Lorenzo and all around San Francisco Bay. That's where we find a lot of these. And what we find is that the people are going out in their tule boats in the sloughs and probing the bottom with these harpoons that are attached to long shafts of wood. And they're probing the bottom because they want to skewer bat rays. And so they pull them up. And we know because we get the spines in the archaeological sites, so good indicator. So that was also a big part of their diet, bat rays and stingrays. Next slide. All the pinnipeds you can imagine were food. At Andy Nuevo, we have a pretty good spectrum of them. I worked with a lot of marine biologists who were doing isotopic studies of their bones, see what they're eating, what their diet, what their range was. We have northern fur seal, harbor seal, stellar sea lion, California sea lion, whales when they washed up, dolphin, and you know what's missing? No elephant seals. Not a one. Andy Nuevo is all about the elephant seal. And they're destroying my archaeological sites. They're like bulldozers all over the damn thing. So I have a thing about the e-seals. And it's a marvelous story, okay? They were down to like one breeding pair, and that's what got the state to buy Andy Nuevo to create a reserve. They were thought to be extinct in California for a long time. They were hunted to nothingness, and then this breeding pair shows up at Año, state buys it, creates a reserve, later Andy Nuevo State Park. Now they breed about 2,000 pups a year, and they're all genetically alike. And they're destroying their habitat because they're denuding the vegetation, and we're getting steeper escarpments, so they're moving out. Where are they showing up? Cambria, right? Maybe you saw in the news a couple weeks ago, these park rangers are shooing them off of Highway 1, and they're showing up at the mouth of Ocean River, too. So they're starting to diversify because they've messed up their home. Andy Nuevo now has steep escarpments, the erosion is horrendous there. So anyway, pinnipeds are very important. They love fur seals because of the high fat in their diet. They needed a high-fat diet because of the temperatures outside. And they're not easy to catch. Fur seals are like pit bulls. They always have a guard, so you got to take out the guard first. You can see these guys say, "You do it." No, you do it. Because you don't get bit by one of those things. Pretty gnarly. Next slide. Okay, artifacts. We do have artifacts. These are artifacts from a coastal site that dates between 6,000 and 3,000 years ago. At that time, the bow and arrow didn't exist. They're using darts or throwing spears. We call it atlatls. And what's amazing about this collection, and this is only a fraction of them, I acquired them from a collector when we picked up a property in Coast Aries, one of the major archaeological sites of the region. I knew who these collectors were. I said, well, state property now, what would you think about donating those to the parks, because they're going to outlive you. These points are 6,000 years old. What are you going to do with them? And the light bulb went off. They said, okay. And they returned them to parks. I gave them a letter for their tax guy. I think I gave them a value. And now they're back in public domain, and that's sold them. And so what's interesting about these are the types, their variety of types, and how they're hafted. But more interesting is the materials they're made from. Because a lot of them are made from a flint called Franciscan chert. Franciscan chert occurs on the other side of the San Andreas Fault. So that's Santa Clara Valley, San Francisco Bay. On this side, you have the Monterey cherts, a black stone, silicious stone, but that's only found in Andy Nuevo at low tide, where the outcrops are. So they're like dyeing the water. I can see who's coming from where when I find these materials. So at this one site by Davenport, we see a great exchange because 6,000 to 3,000 years ago, the people of the Bay are going back to the coast and over. And in Scotts Valley, we have the mirror image of the points. In Los Gatos, there's the other half. So we can see the migration, and it's not really a migration, it's just a bigger ramp, a bigger house. And so they're going back and forth. About 1000 BC, that stops. And we start seeing the coastal people develop territory, and the polities I showed you in the map emerge. What is going on? People are becoming territorially circumscribed, as we call it. Well, what's going on is population exceeds carrying capacity for roaming. And so we start seeing territorialism divide and a focus on acorn harvesting. Acorns are highly nutritious. They're rich in carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, but they're toxic. They have a high handling cost. And so people earlier were harvesting grass seeds from the meadow, from the native grasses, and milling those. But it takes about 13 acres of meadow to support a family. So you need large meadowlands, more reason to burn. But after a while, it overtakes them, and so we see the acorn technology take over. When you harvest acorns in the fall, the families gather hundreds of pounds per family, and they build a granary to store them in for the winter. Well, when you do that, you give up your mobility. You're now tied to the acorn cycle. And that's what's happening in Santa Clara Valley and San Francisco Bay, where there were huge oak orchards. We call them orchards because the native people were tending them regularly. When Vancouver comes into San Francisco in 1796, he gets some horses and rides to Mission Santa Clara. In Mountain View, he comments, it looks like an English garden, because there's no understory, well, then. And he says the oaks are enormous. He measures one at 15 feet across at the trunk. Well, those become, because they've been tended for generation after generation to produce acorn. So that's what we call oak orchards now. All right? The Spaniards couldn't see the garden because there were no fences around them. Okay, next slide. So about 1000 BC, all of those diverse points disappear. No longer do you see any Franciscan church on the coast. You only get the Monterey church. And the people in Andean labor are going, this is great, because we're sitting on the source. And now they can export it and make a profit, an economic return through exchange that way. So these become the dominant point types on the coast until the bow and arrow shows up around 1100 AD. So the bow and arrow is a new invention. Shows up about 900 years ago, and it's a game changer for how people hunt. Next slide. Bow and arrow hunting can now be done by individuals rather than groups of people. And so those are highly technological. They take months to make. Not everybody has access to bow wood. They're very difficult to produce, and so you see specialists producing them. A lot of bows from this area are coming from Mount Hamilton. On the other side, we have yew trees and larger juniper trees, which make good bow wood. Wild plum was also a bow wood. So bows and arrows become technologically complex. Remember, all we get are the stone tips. So when you want to learn about the rest of the technology, you have to go further afield to learn about it. Next slide. Obsidian was coveted here. Obsidian only shows up where there are volcanoes, and there are no volcanoes here. But the people had buying power. They had the Olivella shell. So they could import through trade from neighbor to neighbor to neighbor to the obsidian sources at great distances. We can fingerprint each obsidian piece using a spectrograph. Each obsidian flow in the west has its own chemical trace elements. So when I find obsidian here on the coast, which is as far as it can go, I can take it to a specialist with a spectrograph. They get a reading of its material, and we can trace it to the source it comes from. So what I'm here to tell you is these guys were getting it from all over the place because they had the money. They had the coastal material. And so we find obsidians here from Napa Valley, Clear Lake, Mount Canocti, which may not seem far to you guys, but remember, you got a car. And you got a bridge to get over it and to get there, right? They did not. We also have obsidians coming from east of Yosemite in the Great Basin, from Monoglass Mountain, Casa Diablo, Bodie Hills. Been to Bodie? State Park? State Park? Anyhow, Bodie, all around the hills are obsidian sources, and those obsidians are showing up here. So you get an idea that these guys are not so simple, actually. Next slide. And so we have very few images of the native people of the region. This is one. There was a French ship that came into San Francisco, and in the day before cameras, they had watercolor artists on board who painted images of places and people. And on this one expedition, there was a French watercolor artist named Louis Chery, He was 21 years old, and he painted the people from Mission Dolores in San Francisco, and this is one of them. So we have very few of these images. He gets murdered in Acapulco shortly thereafter by bandits. But they do have his watercolors at the Bancroft Library, which I have access to. So I'm showing you these hunters on San Francisco Bay. First thing my students notice is, hey, they're not wearing any clothes. Because we're such prudish people. For Native people, that was not an issue to that degree. Many men went without clothes here year-round. And they did that because they're not riding horses after buffalo with buckskins on. They're living with the herds. And your clothes retain the human scent. And so the people are spot burning selected patches near their villages because the new shoots attract game. So they're predicting where the game will be and managing it. And in so doing, they're trying to reduce their impact with the herds that are living close by. So that's why they're not wearing these clothes, because that makes it difficult to get around. The animals will scent you. And so with native hunting strategy, you're able to work your way into the herd by wearing the deer hide, the deer horns on your head, and behave like the deer. You get into the herd, and you can pick your target, like wolves do. And that keeps the herd healthy and intact. Because if you shoot the alpha male, the herd disperses, and you're out of luck. The neighbors like it, but you're out of luck. And so that's why these guys aren't wearing clothes. It's funny, Preston, when he writes up, he comes up here, he writes about the Indians of the Andy Nuevo, says they're such wild-mannered people, and they're fair-skinned. And you're like, well, they're not so fair-skinned, actually. But, think of time of year, right? If you're out like this, and it's hot in summer, you're going to be pretty dark. Wintertime, a little lighter. I don't know. But in any case, people in our culture kind of hung up on that. So I bring it up. In any case, the bows are sinew-back reflex bows. They're covered with deer tendon, which gives them a very powerful pull. I'm an archer, so I can appreciate that. The Russians commented on the bows from this area and said they're beautiful, they're fabulous. The strongest among us could not pull one back. So it gives you an idea of what's involved. And they're using quivers made out of silver fox. And the quiver has the point sticking out of the front, because they're not like Robin Hood pulling left to back, which never works, because if you have barbed arrows, they're going to jam, right? So you got to make a thing like that. And in their ear, they have deer bone awls. Because projectile points, like stone tools, get dull, you have to sharpen them. And so they chip them with the tines of deer antlers and so forth. But they got no pockets, right? So they're in their ear. Next slide. This is a picture of a man, a Yokis people from Los Banos, and this is very much like the people here. When you go to hunt, you pray, because you're taking a life. There's a whole process of whether you're spiritually centered to do it. And oftentimes they keep the bows and arrows in the sweat lodge, the saunas. They put them in the rafters to keep the human scent off. You smoke them, and that way there's all kinds of rules and prohibitions. And when you disregard the rules, that's when things bad happen. Because you're living in the spiritual world all the time. And when you do things wrong, it can retort on you. Sickness, accidents, all those things are due to some abrogation of the rules. Right? So this is a man who's ready to go hunting, at least with the camera. And he's giving you an idea of what was going on these meadow tops here. Because the meadow tops here were places that were burned regularly to keep the oaks open and the browsing land for the animals they hunted. The redwoods, not so good. And down below. You're not spending a lot of time in the redwood. Redwood is productive for basketry material with ferns. There are fish runs. There are resources in the redwoods, but you're not going to set up house in the redwoods. It's pretty damp. So the ridge tops like this become important for the gathering of resources. Next slide. And what are they hunting? Well, they're hunting all the animals you can imagine. In the day, there were pronghorn, lots of pronghorn, lots of elk. We had tule elk here, and deer. Have you ever seen a tule elk? If you see an elk, you're looking eye to eye with him. They're big animals. I checked these. Look at you. I told my students, hey, deer, they go, yeah, check. Whoa, wait a minute. Put yourself in the moment. There you are with this animal looking at you in the brush. Big rack of antler, you got a stick with a piece of stone on the end of it, And you're going to jam him with that? You know, what do you think he's going to do? So hunting is dangerous. Meat was not on the table every night, right? It's a dangerous business. Next slide. And, okay, I stumbled into a group of elk there, and I thought, oh, aren't they pretty? Until I realized they're all males. And on the other side of me were all the females. And I thought, this isn't healthy, you know? So I kind of moved myself. But it gives you an idea of, you know, what the day, in the day, what it would be like. So, next slide. Burning. I can't emphasize enough how important burning of the landscape was. When Kresge writes in his diary, from Aptos to Half Moon Bay, he comments 12 times on the burned meadows. And he pointedly says the native people are burning the lands to increase the seed harvest. And while they're going along, they're being gifted lots of hazelnuts. Now, when we do archaeological sites on the coast, you think, oh, we're going to find lots of burned acorns. We hardly find any. But what we do find are lots of hazelnuts. Because the oak woodlands here are distributed. They're not concentrated like Santa Clara Valley. So the acorn economy is a little harder here. So we find milling stones like mortars and pestles way up on ridges. You know, they look pretty awkward because they have to work hard to add acorn to the diet here, which they do. But hazel are the big fire responders. You don't see it so much anymore, or when you do, it's all like all wispy because it's trying to reach for the light. But in the day, hazel is very fire responsive. It's also material for making baskets, and it has medicinal qualities too. So they're burning to increase the hazel production. Next slide. Takaishi, in 1915, he's been living in the Museum of Anthropology for a few years, gaining a little weight. And as you can see, and the anthropologist convinced him to go back to his homeland and teach them how he lived, which he does. And he becomes the anthropologist then. And he's teaching all these dimwit white guys who don't know how to survive in the woods, and he takes them on and says, this is how you do it. Shows them how to make bows, harpoons, and he goes back in his element. Ishi was a marvelous individual. He died in 1916 from tuberculosis. He had no resistance to those diseases, which is true of many Native people in the Americas. In any case, on the right there you have an arrowhead from Mission Santa Clara, and it's very small. People that have arrowhead collections oftentimes don't know most of the collections are actually darts, because arrow tips have to weigh less than a nickel. They're very tiny, right? Most of the projectile points, like the National Park symbol, those are darts. Next time you see a ranger, say, that's a dart, that's not an arrowhead. All right, and they'll be amazed. Next slide. So all the animals are food, even bears. There was a time they had a lot of grizzly bears here. I went to Yellowstone a few years ago, and on 2 occasions I saw grizzly bears stalking full-grown buffalo for food. And I'm thinking, I'm not hiking out there. So what was it like? How did they coexist? These are questions we don't have answers to. How did they coexist? There were a lot of grizzly bears here. And here's a thought. They probably didn't hibernate. A friend of mine, Mark Vanderpool, who lives nearby, came up with this idea and said, I don't think these things were hibernating here. It's not that cold. And I thought, okay, let's add them to the mix all the time, right? So how did that work? Well, grizzly bears are important because they're aerators of the soil. They dig for roots and things that's good for the ground. And we do find grizzly bear bones in the archaeological sites. So the Native people did take them out on occasion. I've also found evidence of Native people being mauled by grizzly bears. So how'd that work? We don't know. I suspect that the people were actually burning and coppicing to increase harvest in certain areas for the bears. You can create space where the bears could go. Keep them out of your village. I don't know, but it's hard to imagine the bears not being interested in the village when you have racks of drying salmon. I've been raided by bears in Tahoe 100 times. Right? They don't even care. They'll take your cooler out. So what was it like? What would it have been like? I can imagine it was very tense on occasion. Next slide. All the ducks, geese, quail, pond turtles, they're all food. Next slide. But this is what's really important. The vegetable foods. There was a time when my neighborhood used to look like that, before I was born. And you're looking at the grasslands of California. Native California grasses are hard to find now. They've been outcompeted by Mediterranean species because of the cattle industry. But the native grasses used to grow tall with seed crop on them that the women could harvest and mill between flat stones to make a flour. And so seed harvest was very important for Native people. And so consequently, the grasslands were important. And that's why they burned. There are more redwood trees here now than there were then. Because our logging has caused this re-thickening of trees, which is kind of a problem. Fires are going to be a problem if we don't do something to kind of involve ourselves. Nature didn't take care of itself. People did here. And so we have catastrophic fires now because no one is managing the land like they should. So in any case, this is an important landscape. The women and the men would burn it every fall, harvest, after the harvest of the seeds. Oaks like it too, because you can get rid of all the pests underneath, all the leaf litter, trees grow healthier. Next slide. And what kind of seeds were they harvesting? A lot of different seeds, including Clarkia and tarweeds. Have you ever seen those seeds the size of pinheads? They're really tiny, so you need a lot of them. Those flower blooms you're seeing in the news right now, those are all seed-producing plants too. So when they have those blooms, they're harvesting all of those seeds for food. On the right is a handstone and milling slab used for milling these seeds into food. We can get plant residues off these stone tools now. We can do a chemical mix that's way over my head, but I work with PhDs who know this stuff. And so what we do is we float these milling tools together with a chemical matrix to extract the pollens and the phytoliths so we can see what plants are being eaten and used. So next slide. This is a picture of a woman in Ukiah. It's hard for me to say Ukiah. It's Yokayo in the native language. And she's harvesting seeds with a winnowing basket and a burden basket on her, a cone-shaped basket on her hip. And so these are part of the toolkits that were necessary. Women were very, very busy people in Native society. They're doing the basketry, and basketry requires a lot of attention. You have to burn the plants years in advance to get the right growth, to be the right strength. You have to coppice various plants, prune them to get them nice and straight for your basketry work, because plants don't grow straight unless you help them. Your arrowwood, to be straight, you have to prune the brush so that you get straight shoots, and then you can harvest them. It can take years to make things right for use. So basically the people are gardening all the time. Next slide. These are acorn granaries from the Sierran people who still remember how to make them. And so I use it by example. In the fall, you harvest hundreds of pounds of acorns for your family, and you put them in one of these granaries. You line them with leaves like bay leaves. And a lot of my students say, well, how to keep the rodents out? No problem. That's what the kids are there for. The kids are there all the time, and they're going to bag whatever rodent comes along, and he goes into the crock pot too. So, you know what I mean? So it's not an issue per se. Next slide. Milling acorns is labor intensive. First step is you gather the acorn out of your storage compartment, the granary, and then you split it on a rock and take out the meat. And look at these baskets. I want you to notice the designs. These baskets are some of the finest on the planet. Those designs are not painted on. They're woven in with different plant material. And they mean things. They have symbol. They're text. Next slide. Okay, so then you need a mortar and pestle to pound the acorn in. Where are you going to get one of those? Well, you got to make them. You peck them out with hard rocks and grind them and shape them until you get bowls. Sometimes they're portable and sometimes they're fixed as bedrock outcrops. And maybe some of you have them on your properties here because this ridge is a good spot for them. So in any case, this is what women are doing and making these tools. Next slide. So that's a woman from Los Banos pounding acorn for the anthropologists with the camera. And so you pound it until you make a flour. Next slide. And in this scene on the left is a Los Banos Sioux woman, and she's pounding the acorn. On the right of her there is a little brush. It's made out of the fiber of soap lilies, the soap root, which is springing up all over the Meadowlands right now. And so they gather those as food too, which I'll mention. But those are soap root brushes, and the people still make them. And you use them for cleaning your baskets, for picking up the powder that's outside the mortar, whisk broom it back in. You clean your house with them. They're general purpose whisk brooms. On the right is a woman from Yosemite. She's Alani, the Alanichi people. And she's got a basket of pounded acorn meal. It looks like polenta at that stage. The next step is to sift it. And on the lower right is a sifting basket. That's where you put the powder in and shake it back and forth. The coarse particles separate from the fine, and you put the coarse particles back in the mortar and make it fine, because you're not going to feed your family lumpy meal, right? So all of that is a process. So now you've sifted the acorn, and you're ready to take the poisons out of it. To take the poison out, they'll dig a depression in the ground, line it with grape leaf or some kind of leaves, and put the powder in and pour boiling water over it. Some people use cold water, but a lot of tribes are using hot. How are you going to pour that water if you don't have clay pots or metal? Well, the women wove the baskets so fine that when they were wet, they swelled and became watertight. Can you imagine a basket holding water? That requires a lot of skill. So what they'll do is they'll take a couple baskets full of water, put it by their hearth, and in the hearth they'll have little rocks about soap, size of a soap block, and with oak wood tongs they'll get them, white hot, pick up the rock, dip it in the first basket, and that takes the stuff off of it. Then you dip it in the second basket, that's the water you use for pouring over the acorn meal. Next slide. And this is Essie Parrish, who was the last shaman of her people. She was called a Yomta from the Kashaya Pomo, and she passed away in the late 1970s. I knew her when I was about 18, but she was the last dreamer for her people, a medicine person. For the Kashaya Pomo, women became specialists after menopause, and then they could be sacred. And at that point, they were oftentimes the medicine people, and she was one. And she danced in a large round dance house, and when she passed away, they buried her in the dance house. It's locked still, because she said there are no more dreamers. And there she's waiting, someday there will be, and then they'll open up the dance house again. So that's her, and she's putting on a show for the anthropologists, which really frosted the rest of the Kashaya people. They didn't want non-Indians to know all this, but she said she felt that there was a purpose in the teaching. So we're lucky to know what we know. But look at the basket. Those dark patterns are maidenhair fern, which is pretty difficult. Okay, so that's the leaching basin for pouring the water in to leach the acorn powder out. Next slide. That's what's happening on the left. They're dipping the hot rocks into the water. On the right, the water is being ladled into the acorn meal, and there's a brush in hand to break the impact of the water. So you leach it out, and you create this gooey kind of gummy mass. A lot of times women would dip the ball of acorn mash into another basket because they get gravel bits on them and sand. So you kind of dip it to get rid of it. Next slide. You can cook in a basket with hot rock cooking. And I always ask my students, have you ever tried this? And some people raise their hands sheepishly and say, yeah. And I'll say, well, did you like it? And they want to only be offensive. So I say, oh, kind of, But I laugh because most demonstrations, that's as far as people go. But that's not the way people ate it. They used to eat it with salt, with fats in it, foods, It's like rice or potatoes. You add things to it, Sometimes even red earth to get the iron supplement you need. So it's a stock. You add things too. It can be baked into a bread as well. Very nutritious stuff. You can go to Korean markets and still buy an acorn meal and make these tofu-like blocks out of it. It's pretty good. I highly recommend it. Okay, next slide. I should also interject. My family's from Holland. I was born here, but I go back sometimes to see the older country. And as an archaeologist, I'm looking at, well, what was it like way back when? And you know what I see? Mortars, pestles, harpoons, bows and arrows, thatched houses, not so distant in some ways. Sometimes the acorn harvest fails. And when it does, because nature's not consistent all the time, you got to go to plan B. Sometimes buckeyes can serve as plan B. They're not so good for storage, and they're also toxic, but it can be an alternative food. Next slide. All the berries you can imagine are food. You harvest what you want, eat them fresh, but what are you going to do with the leftovers? Well, you throw them in the mortar. The mortar is the cuisine. You throw everything in the mortar, pound it up, you can make this into a berry mash, lay it out to the sun, and make fruit roll-ups out of it that preserve very well. Mortars are important for that too. Next slide. I mentioned soaproot earlier. Soaproot is one of many plants, and I touch on it as a talking point, just to give you an idea of the value of plants. So superroot is springing up now. It's a bulb about the size of your fist. It's like a giant onion. It has a skin on the outside. That's the fibrous part. They're very hard to dig out of the ground. So the women and the young girls would go into the meadows every year with long digging sticks, and they put weights on the end of them. That donut is that socket's on the end of the shaft. So you can get some weight and shove it in the ground and pry up the ground and pull out the bulb, and you put the little ones back so you have harvest next year. And I want to point this out because early anthropologists say, oh, the people were nomadic or whatever. They were never nomads. They weren't simple. If you're going out there digging like this year after year for millennia, that's tilling. You're tilling the ground. And that's what's going on. And burning with the charcoal, that's putting charcoal back in the ground too, which is good for the plants. So this is the system that's going on. Superroot is toxic, and they ate it nonetheless by digging big pits in the ground and cooking them in the ground, luau style, with hot rocks, layers of bulbs, more rocks, more bulbs. You fill it up, you cover it with dirt, build a fire on top, and you pour water on it, and it steams the contents. Now, they would have to cook superroot for up to 36 hours to make it edible. So this is something you do communally, not individually. It's the most common archaeological feature I find, burned rocks, fire-affected rocks. Archaeological sites are littered with them, and a lot of that's the result from these earth ovens. So bulbs are important. Also has antibiotic qualities. You can pound it into a lather, make a nice shampoo. You can also pound it in still water streams, and it takes the oxygen out of the water, and fish float up. So you can harvest fish that way with no ill effect. Don't do this at home. Fishing game does not approve. So it's just one bulb out of many to give you an idea of what they knew and how little we know. And what we do know comes from the descendants who tell us. Next slide. Insects, the other big part of the diet. All my students go, oh, and I go, okay, next time you eat a shrimp, take a long look at that thing. Right? Little antennas going around. So it's obviously a cultural affectation. When I go to gatherings and food is put in front of me, I'm not going to sit there and say, no thanks. So when I camped with the Mona one year, I got shish kebab caterpillar. They're pretty crunchy, not a lot of meat. And then you've got the grasshoppers, which are roasted, and you don't eat the heads, you eat the thorax. They're kind of buttery. They're not bad, actually. And what do you do with the leftovers? Because when you have these burns, they're gathering lots of these grasshoppers that are overcome by the smoke. And you gather way more than you can eat. Well, guess what? You throw them in the Cuisinart too. Pound them up into a paste, make it a powder, and you can store it and add it to your acorn meal later. Very nutritious. Next slide. So harvesting plants, managing the land, it's a continuous process, and that's why the territories are so small. They're 10 by 10 square miles on an average, because that's what you can manage. That's your garden, and that's where your villages are. And those other guys, well, they're over there. This is what we do. That's Kathleen Smith on the left. She's a pomo basket weaver, and she's in the sedge swamp, and she's pulling out the rhizomes from the sedge to straighten them out, the root, and she'll come back 3 years later to harvest it for basket. That's the way it works. Poison oak, willows, all of those parts of the plants are used as basketry material. Next slide. And baskets are beautiful. These are from the Central Valley. There are not very many Ohlone baskets around, and I use the word Ohlone collectively. Most are in Russia, along with the other good stuff like feathered capes and arrows and bows. They're all in Russia at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, their version of the Smithsonian, because they were trading with the Indians, not conquering them. And so they got gifted high status things. So not only do they have baskets, they got really cool ones, stuff that wasn't in your everyday kitchen where there were gifts and high status gifts, and they have them all. Next slide. Every family would have a collection like this. You have your seed beater baskets in the upper right, also basket trays and filters, because they pound up manzanita and toyon into a pulp, pour water through it, collect the water underneath, you get this really rich, vitamin C rich Kool-Aid, drink out of that. So sifting trays. On the left is an acorn storage basket from in the house. On the lower left are serving bowls. And on the right is a cooking basket for dropping hot rocks in. Look at the design. You can see it on the inside. That's strictly an expression of art. and beauty. And when women weave these baskets, they start at the bottom, weave their way out, and they have to be perfect, because there's no room for an error. A lot of old-time basket weavers that I used to know from up north would say they dream the basket first. They see the design, and they start the image, and they work their way out. And you have to be right. You can't make basket when you're nursing children. You can't make basket when you're on your home time. There's all these rules that go with it. I learned, I got adopted in a Sioux family when I was 20 once, and I went through a ritual with one of their sons, and what they told me, it may not be true for here, but I'll tell you what they told me, was that women are spiritual. Men have to go through ritual. We have to go through ceremony to be sacred. Women are sacred, and their moon time is part of that cycle of holiness. So we have to go through ritual. Women are inherently sacred. Okay, so that's the way the Lakota put it, and it may be true here too, I don't know. Next slide. This is an Ohlone basket of status and wealth, because the money's on it. There shall be money. This was on loan to Santa Clara University from the Smithsonian when I took this picture, and it's missing things. What it's missing is it used to be fluorescent red, because they took the acorn woodpecker scalps and the pileated woodpecker, the bright red scalps, and they took each down feather and put one in each stitch, so that these baskets were completely covered with fluorescent feathers. And on the top, they took the quail top knots, the top plumes, and lined the top with them. So they brought it off of this basket. But it used to be iridescent. Next slide. So some acquaintances of mine, John Johnson and Brian Bibby, went to Russia to look at the collections, and they had like no time, but they photographed, looked at what Russia had, and wrote a book that just came out recently called Treasures of Native California, Altamira Press. You can buy it on Amazon. It's gorgeous. And it gets into the nitty-gritty, the details of things. But I stole this from their book. So you're looking at a Russian basket from San Francisco Bay. It could have been Santa Clara Mission or Dolores. They're ambiguous about that. But look at the wealth on the basket. It's got abalone pendants on it. Next slide. That's another one that's in Russia. We don't have any of this stuff. Next slide. Because the money was important. And as I've already talked to you about Olivella shell, it goes back a long ways. Next slide. When they were building Highway 101 in San Jose in 1980, that was my first archaeological project. And we found a hearth 5 meters deep. That's like 18 feet below surface. It's deep. And in the hearth, we found burned rabbit bone and Olivella shell. Both returned a date of 9,400 years. So that shell was there. No dietary value, remember, it's all symbol. I just got done looking at 28,000 shell beads from Mission Santa Clara, because they continue to use them into the mission period. Only now they're using iron needles to drill the holes, so the holes are straight. And they're still perpetuating their money in the missions. So my point to that is that goes on to about 1846. Through the Mexican period, when the missions are broken up by the Mexican government, the Indians still live there. At Santa Clara, there were 5 rows of adobe apartments for 1,400 married couples. And they're there until the gold rush hits. So the Native people are still at the missions, even after the missions are broken down. They become part of the mission community. In any case, it's got to be the oldest coinage on the planet. I don't know of anything that compares to that. Next slide. And the coins change in style through time. So we can date archaeological sites by the style of beads. Like these rectangle beads with a central hole, the hole changes after a while, it comes to the top. These we call sequence beads because they're not formed on necklaces. They were appliqued to a fabric, edge to edge to edge, like sequins. And so that's what we call them. And we find them in position on burial sites where the individuals have them, but the fabric is gone. So we don't know what that looked like. But we can date them because they're time sensitive. And so beads can serve as markers of time in archaeological sites. Next slide. Abalone pendants. They're not pendants. They're not jewelry. They're badges. Every society, every village has social institutions, clubs, membership. And you strove to be part of a membership group. And you had to pay dues with shell beads. And you wore the regalia of the membership. And you put on ceremonial events. There's a calendar. It goes with your community and obligations for your group. If you get pulled over by a highway patrolman, God forbid, okay, you get pulled over, you know who he is, right? He's got a big badge, he's got buttons that are all shiny with logos on them, he's got stripes on, he's got regalia and symbols, that was me. He's got symbols all over himself, right? Well, that's what these are. These are membership symbols. Next slide. And they change in different styles and shapes over time. Next slide. These are my favorites. And what you're seeing in the middle is what we call a big head pendant. And it's the effigy that goes with a religious movement called Kuksu. In San Jose, Bob, at the Tamian Station site, I think I found the oldest ones. They dated to about 900 AD, which is when this is picking up. And so what it represents is an individual who represents the spirit world by putting on this huge headdress. It looks like a dandelion with rods radiating out and feathers on the end. And they dance in a subterranean dance house, which is only affluent villages have those. At any rate, the Kuksu, next slide, is that guy. That's the Kuksu. And in his hand, he has rattles made out of split elderberry, clapper sticks. They sound like rattlesnakes when you shake them. These people did not have drums. They did have hollow logs that they stood on with a post and pounded on. They had bird bone whistles. They had rattles made out of cocoons, ceanothus cocoons. They put pebbles in there, and they make a rattle sound like a baby rattle, very sharp. And that was the kind of music they had. But this is the Kuksu. In Elodian society of the Bay, there was a high-status community of women called the Mayen. And the Mayen picked who the Kuksu dancer was. So they had to be somebody special in the community to represent this spirit person. But it's fabulous. Most people are familiar with Native Americans with the old feathered bonnet, you know, guy on a horse with a Winchester. You know, that's the classic, you know, Plains Indian image. But that's a brief period of time with a horse. Very brief. This is ancient. This goes back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. Next slide. And that's a dance house. This one is at Indian Grinding Rock State Park, where the Miwoks still gather every September. They have the acorn harvest festivals at Kuksu, and you can camp in the campground with them, but you won't get any sleep, because the Paiutes are coming up to gamble. And so the hand games are going all night too, the singing, and it's a lot of fun. I've lost my shirt playing those games. But these are architecturally monumental buildings, and you know, to cut the kind of tree to make the timber means you're burning below a tree and hacking at it with a stone axe, a hand axe, and you have to do that repeatedly till the tree comes down. These are labor-intensive structures. We have one, or had one, at near Andy Nuevo at the cultural preserve I was telling you about. It was called the village of Matini, and Portola talks about dropping in the valley and seeing a round house. They called it Casa Grande, the big house. And he said it was big enough to hold the entire village of 200 people. So these are where you have affluent villages. Next slide. And here you have dancers that would take, you know, this is what they looked like when they were in the dance house. They're wearing bandoliers made out of flicker feathers, they're bright orange. And they're taking 2 quills from each woodpecker to make these bandoliers. It takes about 1,600 feathers to make one. So they're putting on a show for the anthropologist who's in the center, and they don't like it. Because this is being done about 1926 or so, and Native Americans were only just recently allowed to be citizens at that time, 1924, and Native American religions were outlawed in the United States until the Native American Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1976. Yeah, digest that for a minute. So why don't they remember a lot of the old ways? Well, because of the intrusion that happened in between. A very difficult time. So here they're putting on the show as requested. Notice the beards and mustaches, because that's another stereotype we have. Native people had beards and mustaches. Portola talks about seeing guys with long beards and mustaches, as long as the oldest hermit, he wrote once. So again, images we have, you got to get rid of them and go with this. Okay, next slide. Flutes were made out of all the wing bones of large birds, pelican, geese, hawks, herons, condors. They're making whistles out of those. I have found whistles glued together in different sizes, so you know that they had panpipes, but we don't know what the music sounded like. Next slide. Cocoon rattles, these are made of ceanothus. Those are those big, like, moths that fly around, give you the creeps. But they make these big larvae. On the left is a cocoon rattle covered with feathers. I have one of these at home, and when you rattle it, it's as sharp as a baby rattle, like I mentioned. So picture 100 dancers together, each with their rattles and their clapper sticks, keeping rhythm, bird bone whistles with the monotone hooting, and the women wore buckskin aprons and braided grass skirts. And on the buckskin aprons, they tied abalone shell pendants. And in some places in California, they put obsidian blades on there. And women dance in place. They go back and forth. And so the dresses move back and forth. And they sound like wind chimes. So it gives rhythm to the music that way. Next slide. This is a dance apron. It's made out of milkweed fiber. Milkweed, those are the weeds you're pulling out of your yard. They have fiber. And I flipped it over to take this picture. They're hawk feathers. Where are you going to get that many hawk feathers? Well, you got to make this thing. To make things means you make time. It means you have to be spiritually centered to make things. Native people talk to me about making things. That is a time you have to set aside for it. And to make things, you have to be centered. So to gather this many hawk feathers, you're looking at a lot of centering going on. But I flipped it over because on the inside of the neck, see those red stitches? Well, no one sees that, because they're not putting it on as a costume like Halloween for a show. They're putting it on because the formula requires it. And when they put this stuff on, they transform. They're becoming sacred, sacred beings. So that's a transformative process. And these outfits are part of that. Next slide. To make the bandoliers, the flicker feather bandoliers, and you need a lot of woodpecker quills. So you catch them with basket traps. And there was a time we had a lot of down oak woodlands, down timber, that would attract these birds. Where are you going to get that many quills now? Well, that is the problem. It's very hard for Native people to maintain their traditions because you can't get the things that they need that are part of the formula for doing things right. So that is a conflict. Next slide. And there you see the flicker on the right. That's the flicker, right? You got ornithologists out there? I get them confused. 3 woodpeckers. I know that. So in any case, there's a band, one of the bandoliers. And in the upper left is a Chori painting from Mission San Francisco, one of his studies, his sketches that he put together. This is all we got. Next slide. And this is another one of his pictures. It's a portrait of the men at Mission Dolores in San Francisco, and they're painted half red, half black. The red is cinnabar, and the red vermilion paint is coming from Mount Umanum, from behind us here. By the way, I told you about the creation story. The word for hummingbird in the native language is alun. Umanum is named after hummingbird. It's a creation place. We've been bringing, I've been working with Midpan, that now owns that property, Mount Umanum, and introduced them to the Algonquin people today. This is the contemporary Ohlone people. And they have created a dance ground on top of the mountain for them. It's a new paradigm shift going on. It's refreshing, finally. Right? But on the other side, down below, is where the red paint was coming from. And the people traded for it. The red paint was very valuable. In fact, we read about the people from here fighting battles with the people over there for control over it. They did have warfare. Next slide. Dance headdress, milkweed fiber hairnet, some magpie feather headdress. You hold it up with those nice deer ball pins, on your head, and this becomes a part of the regalia for dance. Next slide. These are belts made out of dog mane with feathers and shell beads. There are none of these in this nation. These are in the Museum of Man in Paris, but they were collected from the peninsula. Next slide. Sacred things. In Native society, there were priests, there are doctors, and there are sorcerers. And each has a role to play. You don't mess with the sorcerers. So there are sacred places, places where holy people go to recharge. Now, in many parts of California, not everyone can go to those places. Only a specialist can go to commune with the spiritual side. And so mountaintops often are that, or even ridge tops. Certain ridge tops create silhouettes that become part of their worldview. And those silhouette ridge tops can become sacred places where shamans go. So think of Castle Rock, right? With all the rocks out there. There are bedrock borders around Castle Rock, but there's no art in the rocks. Too many climbers. You're not going to see them. It's all, eroded. But no doubt there were paintings there once. On the right is a Chumash shaman from Santa Barbara. His skirt is made out of braided eagle down. So these are very important people. Next slide. Pipes were part of shaman's toolkit. They made them out of stone, drilled them with stone drills, and they took the wild tobaccos, cultivated them secretly, special places, and it's different tobacco than what we're used to. It's a little more stringent. And they would pound the tobacco in small bowl mortars, mix saliva with it, and a little seashell, because the alkali of the seashell released the alkaloids in the tobacco, giving it a narcotic effect. And they would put that into these pipes that they hold straight up, put a glowing ember in, and in one case, the Portola expedition towards San Gregorio meets a group where they offer them tobacco, because the Spaniards have tobacco too, so they exchange. It's pretty cool. Immediately the head man of the community comes out with his pipe, they all gather around, they stuff the pipe with the tobacco, light it up, and they blow smoke as men in the sun. Because tobacco smoking wasn't recreational, it's holy. It's your prayer going out and the return through the pipe. So not everyone is doing this. So smoking was a ritualized process. Next slide. These are what we call charm stones in archaeology because we don't have very good vocabulary. They're much deeper than that. They're used by shamans for healing, and they change in time and style in time. The one on the right, you can see there's a black stain on it. That's asphaltum, and you can see cordage imprints, so it was suspended like a plummet. And it's part of the shamanic toolkit. So all of these are sculpted and made for that purpose. Next slide. These are what we call cupule rocks. They're up by Skyline. You'll find them around about. And they're also shamanic specimen. They're actually like a parade after a parade is left and there's just confetti on the ground. Because the holes are not the object. It's the powder that comes from pecking the holes that they're after. The powder is what's being appliqued for spiritual use. So little cupules, the size of these holes are about the size of a 50-cent piece, if you still see those anymore. So they're small, they're not like mortars. Next slide. And there's the vermilion I was speaking about, the cinnabar. And Mount Amadin was the big producer. It was shipped far and wide throughout the West. And they used wild cucumber as a binding agent. It was gooey stuff. Next slide. And of course, sacred places on the land bound, that they're disappearing fast. Next slide. Because all this comes to a crashing halt with the Portola expedition and the establishment of the Royal Presidio in 1770 and the beginning of the mission system. Spain learned to conquer by having done it for several hundred years in Central America and South America by creating three institutions that were related. One was the Presidio. That's where weights and measures were kept for trade. That's where the law was and government. And it's where the auxiliaries and the military were. Then they created pueblos. Those are civilian towns that were designed by decree of the king to support the presidios with food. And then there's the mission. And the mission was established to bring the native people in, convert them into men of reason, as they said. And the purpose was to make them into citizens of Spain. They did not want to eliminate the people. They needed them to be the colonists. So that was the goal, was to convert them to be the labor force for Spain, because there was not enough incentive for people to immigrate up here into the far frontier. So the idea was to make the native people the root of colonization. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for a couple reasons. Next slide. One of which is the two worlds are completely different. They see things different. They have completely different ideologies. What's right, what's wrong, what's black, what's white. These are all prescribed from the day you're born. Squares, circles, those are all symbols that you learn to read. Like a photograph. When the Yanomami first saw Polaroids, those old cameras where the film slides out and it suddenly appears. These anthropologists took a picture of the Yanomami in Brazil, and they showed them the picture, and these guys were spinning it around. They couldn't see it. We take it for granted, but you're taught how to read a picture. It's flat, and you see the symbolism in it. But for people who don't know that, that's a new thing. Once the anthropologist said, here you are, an outlying person, they went, oh, right? So think of that. When you think about these two worlds coming together, there was no basis for understanding. Next slide. And it gets even weirder. On the right are Chumash paintings that shamans can understand. We can't. On the left is a portrait from Mission San Miguel. Okay, what do you see there? You see the Archangel Gabriel. He's got wings on his back. He's standing in the clouds. And he's standing on the heads of babies. What the heck? How are you going to translate that? Right? So you get it, right? You can see there's a fundamental conflict of ideology. Next slide. And so Native people, when they were brought into missions, at first they were voluntarily coming in, but they couldn't leave. They didn't understand that. When they left, they were punished. That kind of punishment was normal in European culture, but not normal for Native people. So they created conflict. Priests soon learned that marriage was the key to alliance in politics. So they took the unmarried women and locked them up into monjerias, nunneries. And they were trapped in there for 12, 14 hours a day, and they died because hygiene wasn't so good. Sometimes the soldiers preyed on them, and we see venereal disease spread. Also another affectation for the people. Smallpox, the great killer of Native Americans, also comes through and takes down thousands and thousands of people. Next slide. Let the people live. This is a Louis Tree painting, the French guy I was mentioning. When he pulls into San Francisco, the priests go, oh, hallelujah, a European ship. And they tell the Indians to put on a show. And so they have all the feather work, regalia, they've confiscated it, and they give it back to the neophytes, as they call them, to do a show. You can almost hear the Indians say, finally, we can put the world back in balance, because they're not doing it for show, they're doing it for ritual. Next slide. So the missions go for 50 years. Mission Santa Cruz, another state park. We're working to try and interpret this story more holistically. We are now working with Native descendants from the area to tell their story at the mission. Because for Native people, they view the missions as like Auschwitz. It is the pinnacle of the conflicts for them. So we need to interpret these things. On the other hand, I read the priest diaries too. 2 priests, 6 soldiers at each mission with thousands of Indians. Those guys are kind of amazing guys too. So there's a multifaceted story. And you have to see it from many points of view. And of course the priests don't have the benefit of hindsight. They have the culture they come from and the world they live in. So the conflict is such. It's a tragedy. But you can almost see how it plays out. When the Mexican Revolution takes place, the Spanish missions kept land in trust for the Indians. Very few got any. But they did. And so when the Mexican Republic is formed, one of the first things they do is start to privatize the mission landholdings. And the Indians are turned loose. Many continue to stay at the missions, as I mentioned, because by 50 years, that's what they know. That's now their home. Others become the caballeros and the vaqueros on their ranches. Do you think the gentry is doing the cattle work? Heck no. The cowboys are the mission Indians. They are the people. And those are the descendants I work with today. Next slide. So the land was subdivided by 1832. A law was passed to further subdivision. And we see the Great Ranchero period of California. A very brief period of time when cattle become the thing for the hides and the tallow. Next slide. And as the cattle roam wild, nobody cares about the meat. They care about the hide. And so the cattle are roaming wild. In fact, it got kind of dangerous out here with all the steers running loose. And so the landscape changes forever because of all the browsing. The defecation of the cows spreads the European plants, and they spread, and they take over. And so our land is actually a product of those phenomena. Next slide. But the Indians are still here. They become part of the labor force, as I mentioned, in Mexican California. A lot of our schools teach about Native Californians, and they just sort of end at the mission period. And that's a mistake, because the people actually survive it. Next slide. And they continue to be a big part of the land. Next slide. Mexico opens its ports to trade with foreign ships, which Spain did not. And so immediately American and British ships come in for the hide and tallow. Richard Henry Dana writes his book 2 years before the Mass, and it's all about the hide and tallow trade. He didn't like California, so the heck with him. But in any case, with that comes new settlers, like a Swiss immigrant, John Sutter, who gets a land grant in what is now Sacramento, and he creates a fort. It looks like the Foreign Legion out there. He's got Miwoks marching around with wooden rifles. It's like Apocalypse Now. He's out there in the jungle and doing his thing. And then one day a bunch of Mormons come over the Sierras and drop in, because the Mormons are under assault too in Utah at that time. And so they come and they have a diaspora. Yeah, so they come across the Sierras before the Donner Party, before the gold rush, and they go to Sutter's Fort. Sutter hires a guy named John Marshall to build him a sawmill in the Sierra foothills. John Marshall captures the water in a flume to drive a wheel that will move the saw blades up and down. Right? But the flume keeps getting jammed with gravel. So he's picking up the gravel and he's finding a chunk of gold. Eureka, right? And what does he do to keep quiet? No, he goes to Monterey, and it spreads by sea. And next thing you know, you have one of the great migrations of humanity in history. Prior to 1846, the first census of Mexican California has 5,600 non-Indian people. That's Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Diego, San Francisco, San Jose. In the first year of the gold rush, 10,000 people show up. Then 100,000, then 200,000. There is no law, there is no order, and the missions get overrun because the missions have things like fruit orchards, which the newcomers want. The most surveyed point in Santa Clara Valley is the old mission fruit orchard at Santa Clara University. It was surveyed 1,000 times. Everybody wanted those pears. So in any case, trade opens up. Sutter has his fort. It's still a state park. You can go in the middle of downtown Sacramento and see his fort like an island. It's still there. Next slide. But the world rushes in, and California is forever changed. Next slide. We also begin creating laws when we become a state. The first laws we implement are laws of genocide. One of the early laws the California legislature passed was the Indentured Servitude Act. This legalized the sale of Indian children because the miners were killing the parents. And there were so many orphan children that it became a market. You could make money selling kids, and it was totally legal to kill the parents. So that opened bounty on parents. And so we find that many of the gold miners found their fortunes in selling children rather than the gold fields themselves. That law, by the way, continued until 1877, which is 12 years after the Civil War. Did you know that? Okay. We also passed a law that forbade Native people 1/16 or greater blood from testifying in court. So they couldn't testify. They were not citizens of the United States. They could do nothing about the onslaught. The Mission Indians of Santa Cruz fared better because they were perceived to be Hispanic people. And so they were washed over. It's the people in the Sierras who now face that onslaught. Next slide. So as I just said, the California Mission Indians blend in. You know, when you look at some of the people gathering fruit and strawberries in Castroville, we always think about migratory people coming in. But you know what? A lot of California Indians are doing that. So next slide. And so as I close my discussion, I want you to understand that the Native people are still here. These are the people I work with actively in state parks. They have a lot to tell us. I'm speaking about the people of the past, but there are people who can tell you about their culture today, and they're more qualified to do that. Next slide. But we do give permit in parks for the Ohlone people to come and gather things. That's a funny thing, giving permit, right, to Native people. Well, you've got to fill out this permit to gather things. They look at you and go, what? And I diplomatically say, well, it's not to control you. It sends a message to my agency that this is a need and we need to support it. Oh, then it's okay, right? So, I mean, you know, you've got to be careful how you do business. These are Hylkema Ohlone people from San Jose. Rosemary Camer is the tribal chair on the left. She's not doing so well right now, and they've had a change of leadership, but they came to Wilder Ranch to gather tules. I also give permit for shell gathering for the Olivella still. They gathered acorn in Big Basin State Park. So, it's invisible to most people, but it's still alive. Next slide. And I think that's all I've got to say for now. So thank you.